This week we're going to cover a long and important period in Latin American history known as the Age of Exports, which lasted from roughly 1880 to 1930. In this video lecture, I'll discuss the main characteristics of the period, and then in the following two video lectures we'll look closer at two export commodities that boomed during these years, bananas and rubber. This was a period of both change and continuity in Latin American history. Change came in the form of modernization. Over 50,000 miles of railroad tracks were built. Cities were modernized with streetcars, telephones, electric street lighting, movie theaters, and modern port facilities were constructed to handle larger ships. Landowners in the middle class prospered, but the plight of the poor majority improved very little. And in fact, some things didn't stay the same. For example, the social hierarchy from the colonial period still characterized a society. Also, foreign nations still had great influence in Latin America, but now instead of Portugal and Spain, it was Britain, France, Germany, and the United States that came to play a central role in Latin America's foreign relations. And next week I'll talk more about the foreign relations of this period. In political terms, by 1880, liberalism had triumphed in every country in Latin America, and the vision espoused by the conservatives had been defeated. Yet even though the liberal program had won out, politics during these years were hardly reflective of classical liberalism. Among elites, there was a disillusionment with the liberal ideals of the independence era. Ideals such as civil rights, individual liberties, and equality before the law were now believed to have contributed to the chaos of the post-independence period. Politics after 1880, instead, were characterized by authoritarian governments that ruled by force and imposed their wills despite resistance. National states grew stronger as the economy improved, and modern professional armies were trained and equipped throughout the region. Latin American nations from 1880 to 1930 were ruled by oligarchies and dictatorships. Oligarchy means the rule by the few. In Brazil, for example, the monarchy was overthrown in 1889, a year after the abolition of slavery, and a secular republic was established. This allowed the coffee planters to dominate the country's political system. The elite oligarchy during this period comprised about 5% of the population, and they were often landowners and merchants with interest in the export economy. A popular slogan among them during this period, which can even be seen on the Brazilian flag, was order and progress. They wanted social stability and economic modernization. While oligarchies ruled in all the countries, a few countries, such as Mexico, were also ruled by dictators. And that's who you see here on the right. That's Porfirio Diaz. He ruled Mexico for 35 years, from 1876 to 1911. And he ruthlessly dealt with rebels, jailed the political opposition, silenced independent newspapers, and controlled the political system from Congress to the governorships. In place of liberalism, elites now subscribed to a philosophy that originated in France, and it was known as positivism. Positivism was the belief that progress could be achieved through the application of scientific knowledge and the scientific method. Positivists argued for authoritarian government, claiming that liberalism, with its emphasis on civil rights and individual liberties, brought economic and political disorder. Positivism, on the other hand, elaborated the concepts of order, progress, and privilege. Positivists maintained that Latin America's indigenous and African heritage were a negative thing. Racism, in other words, became popular among the elite classes. For that reason, many of the countries sought to promote European immigration as a way to, quote, whiten their populations. Indeed, close to between 8 and 9 million immigrants from Europe settled in Latin America during this period, and most of them came from Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and the majority settled in the southern cone of South America, in Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. Those were their main destinations. As I've mentioned, this period witnessed impressive economic growth, although it was elites, foreign investors, and the growing middle class that enjoyed the fruits of the new wealth. Similar to the colonial period, it was the export of primary products that fueled economic growth. Here I've listed many of the main exports. So throughout Mexico, the Caribbean, Central America, and Brazil, fruits were exported. And we'll talk about bananas in the next video lecture. Minerals such as silver, zinc, copper, iron, and nitrates were exported from Mexico, Chile, and Bolivia. And oil is also a mineral, but it was mainly Mexico and Venezuela that were producing lots of oil during these years. And cacao was exported from Ecuador. And in the southern cone of South America, in the great grasslands of the Pampas, meat, hides, wool were exported from Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And rubber was also a boom product in the Amazonian countries, and I'll spend the third video lecture here talking about rubber. In many countries, just a few export commodities dominated foreign trade. So for example, in El Salvador, coffee made up 80% of the country's exports. In Guatemala, coffee and bananas accounted for 90% of its exports. And cacao comprised 65% of Ecuador's exports. So you can see just a few commodities dominate each country's exports. Under this system, Latin America was put in a subordinate position in the global economy, pursuing economic paths that were largely shaped by the industrial powers in Europe and the United States. So Latin America is producing what these foreign countries demand. In particular, the region became dependent on foreign investments for economic growth. Foreign businesses invested in the expansion of port facilities, roads, railroads, and communication networks. So it was foreign capital, for example, that built the railroads in Latin America. It wasn't domestic capital. And the first oil adventures in Venezuela and Mexico were funded by British and American oil companies. This arrangement included close ties between elites in Latin America and foreign merchants. This economic model did produce a lot of wealth, but its great weakness is that it made Latin America vulnerable to fluctuations in the world market. So for example, if world coffee prices collapsed, that would devastate countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and those in Central America, which depended on high coffee prices for their economic growth. And later, after the midterm exam, when we discuss the Great Depression and World War I and World War II, we'll see how this process becomes clear, because it's going to be those three external shocks, particularly the Great Depression, that's going to undermine this economic model, and it's going to lead to a new economic model after 1930.